the title of the talk today, Tech Oligarchs and the AI Arms Race, a New Age for Capitalism, ? There is indeed an AI arms race, and I think it's at the economic edge of the imperialist competition that we've talked about so much in this conference so far. And the tech bros certainly have too much power. They want us to think that AI is all-powerful or has the potential to be all-powerful, but I don't believe that this is a new age for capitalism. I think it's actually part of a pattern that we've seen again and again play out throughout the history of capitalism in different forms of automation and different forms of technological development. As much as the Sam Altmans and the Elon Musks of the world would have us believe AI is some kind of mythical force, it does not exist just in the cloud. AI is grounded in concrete realities: resources, land, water, labour, investments which have to be paid for, the building of new buildings and data centres, and in particular, and water to cool those buildings. And all of these things can and in fact are being fought over. AI does not inevitably lead us to either utopia or dystopia, but it will exacerbate whatever power relations already exist. And that's why we have to fight the tech oligarchy, the 1% more broadly, and put AI under the control of working class communities, workplaces, and ordinary people. The explosion of AI in the last few years is indeed overwhelming. I gave a talk about automation and robotics maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I said something like, many of you may have heard of ChatGPT. It's like, now who has not heard of ChatGPT? Anthropic's Claude, Meta AI, Google's Gemini, Project Maven are some of the other companies dominating our headlines. You might remember the images at Trump's inauguration of the tech CEOs all sitting in the front row. And of course, Donald Trump appointed Elon Musk to lead his newly created Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, best name for a government department ever, to slash bureaucracy and federal spending, which, you know, sent shivers down the spines of, you know, public servants and the American population. And, you know, he's gutted, the public service. On Wednesday in Australia, Albanese, just this week, signed an MOU with Anthropic's CEO Dario Amodei, who was recently in the news for a stoush with Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, over a military contract with the Pentagon. And there are so many good reasons to be worried about AI, whether it's the environmental impacts, the integration into the war machine, or the frightening phenomenon called AI psychosis. I listened to renowned psychologist Esther Perel do couples therapy with a man in a romantic relationship with his AI bot. Data centers, huge complexes that generate the computing power needed to run AI, pose extraordinary threat to our water security and water equity, and they massively intensify energy consumption. People probably would have seen memes on the internet, like every time you thank, you know, your chatbot, this many, you know, trees in the rainforest cut down, this many litres of water are required. And in New South Wales, in fact, the building of data centres is being rolled out. I believe like 7 have been built just in recent years, and there's 9 more planned. And this is diverting land and water away from housing developments. And there's some of the, you know, councils are starting to speak out. But the invitation of Dario Amodei to Australia to meet with the Prime Minister, statements of Tim Ayers, they, you know, are saying Australia is open for business with AI and pitching themselves in that way. And then, of course, there are the content moderation workers, probably the most invisible part of the AI, you know, supply and labour chain. Their job is to categorize and essentially teach AI by labeling and fixing mislabeled objects and words and so on. And some of the worst work they have to do is get AI to generate the worst possible content. We're talking like violent content, sexual abuse, that AI can come up with so that they can categorize it, so it can be, monitored or not produced for the public. And these people don't have proper mental health care. They're paid abominably, mostly in countries like India, Kenya, Venezuela, and there's millions of them. The Iran war has been referred to as the first AI war. Let's say the Iran war, the bombing of Iran by the US and Israel. In the first 24 hours of the US attack on Iran, Palantir and Anthropic auto-generated 1,000 targets. And actually this experimentation with AI-assisted targeting began in Gaza. Israel's been using Gaza as the AI warfare guinea pig. And the spat that people may have heard of between Sam Altman, OpenAI, and Dario Amodei from Anthropic with the Pentagon misrepresented Anthropic as like the good AI who supposedly refused to give the Pentagon permission to use AI for mass surveillance and to develop completely autonomous weapon systems. But this was a mischaracterization of Anthropic's position, which was that they actually were happy to work with the Pentagon to develop those technologies. They just didn't think that they were ready yet. But within that bleak picture, I want to actually talk about the fight back quite early on in my talk, because there is a fight back already well underway. Some examples of this: in Memphis, the community of Boxtown is fighting against Elon Musk's supercomputer called Colossus, which needs so much power that it's using 35 gas-powered turbines that were not given permits by the local, government bodies, and they were only found out about when people started smelling gas in the air. They're poisoning the air and creating respiratory problems in a predominantly black community, and there's been mass, town hall meetings and mobilizations of people trying to push back against this. The Screenwriters of America went on 148 days of strike in 2023 during COVID, people might remember, and secured a contract that established controls against the misuse of artificial intelligence in Hollywood. Some examples of this is that AI, in their contract, is that AI cannot be considered a writer. Writers cannot be forced to use AI, and AI-generated content cannot be considered source material, which would cheapen the wages of workers working on that material. I mentioned the data labelers in India, Venezuela, and Kenya paid less than €2 an hour in an industry worth $300 billion. There are between 150 to 430 million data laborers estimated by the World Bank, and they've actually set up a newly formed Data Laborers Association, which they say the story of the DLA begins with a simple yet powerful realization. While the world celebrates AI's breakthroughs, the essential human effort behind it goes unnoticed. Data labelers who spend countless hours annotating, categorizing, and refining data are the invisible architects shaping the future of technology. And we've talked a lot about the power of the working class this weekend, and this is an enormous, at the top estimates, 430 million data laborers in the world. That is an incredible source of labor power if those people continue to organize. As I said, I don't think it's useful to see AI as leading either to a dystopia or a utopia, because actually both of these ideas, which are both given fuel in different ways by the tech CEOs, underplay our hands as agents in our own future and underplay the role of those workers, for example, in being able to shape that future. So I think, the debate around AI is often framed between, are we heading to a world of fully automated luxury communism, where we're freed from the drudgery of hard, repetitive labor, and we're all going to have a 4-day weekend. Well, I think this is as naive as thinking that, the invention of microwaves was going to liberate us from sexism, where women now just suffer under the double, triple burden of working full-time and doing the care work, On the other hand, of course, we're offered a Frankenstein monstrosity, the summoning of demons, as Elon Musk himself called it. Imagining a world taken over by robots where there's no jobs left, human beings are relegated to a parasitic slum-dwelling class on the sidelines of production, if not exterminated completely, because AI is as Cory Doctorow, who wrote In-Shitification, puts it, AI wakes up one day and decides to turn us all into paperclips. But there's no scientific or historical basis for this idea, which I think only serves to make us passive and inward-looking. Like any tool and like all tech, people, communities, and different classes will use AI for their own interests. Personally, I quite like the text-to-speech function, so I can listen to those ISJ socialist articles while I'm doing the dishes. And there are promising things that AI could do, assisting in early cancer detection and other advanced health care and scientific roles is one example. Another example I heard of was these young Turkish boys who, it was actually, they did it as a school project. They made an AI tool that could map sounds to track down people trapped under rubble because of the number of earthquakes in Turkey, and they've got funding to actually develop this tool. Another great example that Karen Howe, who wrote Empire of AI and is one of the kind of leading AI journalists, talks about a radio station in New Zealand, a Te Reo Maori radio station that is working with local elders to integrate AI language learning tools into their programming, because there's actually not enough people fluent in Te Reo to do all the translations that they want to do, and a lot of people who want to learn it. And AI is also, there's possibilities of using it to actually revive dead and endangered languages with its, large language models. But if we look, I talked before about the role that AI is playing in the, military industrial complex, and I think war is a good example, because if we look at, what's happening in Iran, Palestine, is the problem AI, or is the problem the slaughter and the genocide and imperialism for profit? I don't want a robot deciding to bomb a school, but I also don't want Trump or Elon Musk or an American soldier or a Zionist IDF soldier deciding to bomb a school with the most advanced, weaponry that we have. I'm not exactly reassured by, the humans that have their fingers on the triggers right now. I mentioned Karen Howe before, author of Empire of AI. She argues that if AI was transportation, then we are being sold the benefits of bicycles while they build rockets, and that we actually can have the benefits of bicycles without environmental destruction, dehumanization, robotic warfare, and job layoffs. But we obviously have to fight for that. The history of capitalism, is a history of technological development that seems to have a life of its own, out of our control. And in fact, Marx had a name for this phenomenon, alienation. And capitalism relies on us feeling alienated and powerless in the face of technology. This is how he described the early days of industrialization. He said the individual machine has now been replaced by a mechanical monster whose body fills an entire factory building with its demonic power. AI is a concentrated example of all the global competition under capitalism, and the 6 biggest firms pouring money into AI are projected to spend $750 billion this year alone. That's more than the GDP of Ireland. AI investments accounted for 60%, up to 60% of all venture capitalist investment in 2025, and around 80% of the growth of the stock markets in 2025. And governments everywhere are reaching for it as the next major productivity leap. China is freaking out the West because they developed DeepSeek on much cheaper nanochips than what the US has used, actually largely thanks to US sanctions. They were forced to train DeepSeek on cheaper technologies. As we've discussed in other sessions, China is not just competing now in mass consumerist goods. They are competing in the high-tech industries like AI and EVs. And this has a lot to do with the rare earths mineral deal that Australia did with the US because they saw an opportunity to make themselves or make Australia indispensable to the US in these industries that require rare earths. This extraordinary growth of AI is fueling speculation about whether it's just a bubble waiting to burst, because the promise of general artificial intelligence, a do-everything machine that exceeds the intelligence of humans, actually has little scientific backing, and surveys of experts in the field have said, majority think it's certainly a very long way off. Many think it's actually not possible at all. People like Cory Doctorow have said that AI should be more equated to advanced plugins, like it can do very cool stuff, but in another language we'd call it plugins. Large language models have been likened to predictive text on steroids. They're actually incredibly superpowered probability machines. I'm obviously not an expert in the tech or exactly what they can do, but I think the important part is there is no consensus that all this money that's being poured in is actually going to deliver the results that that Sam Altman, Dario, what's his name, wants us to believe that it can. And in fact, the anarchic rush to invest in all this capital potentially will create a glut where there's more built than is actually required. This is how a boom turns into a bust. By one estimate, up to $2 trillion in revenue is going to need to be recuperated in profits actually just to pay for what's been put into these data centers already. And this is in a context where our AI firms are not making profits. They're growing on the promise of profits that have yet to materialize. This is all part of a broader trend of automation. Automation under capitalism is not rational. The productivity increases are not shared equally. They are developed and implemented for profit, like all machinery under capitalism. Just, as an example of this, when they deliver automation benefits, robotics into like a car factory, for example, it's not like the bosses say, we've made 100 extra cars this week, why don't you all take Friday off? No, they say, thank you very much, we'll pocket Friday's profits, you can all work just as hard, we'll sack a bunch of you, the rest of you can do unpaid overtime to make up for it. And actually over time, this, pressure brings, because they can get rid of labor, it brings down the costs, it brings down the prices, and ultimately undermines those very profits which were the basis of investment. And that's, it's a very, very brief explanation of, the falling rate of profit, but this is one of the tendencies that Marx talks about can actually drive the system into crisis, where it should be good news for us, things like watches, cars, phones, coffee machines, we've seen them, over our life, over history, they do become cheaper, they do become household goods, whereas once they were luxury goods. But in the bigger picture, our lives are not getting easier. We're not going to work less, and actually we've got more housing insecurity. and the rest of it. I think to make up for this problem, these companies will push us to work harder for longer. They will cut jobs and stifle wages. And I think a lot of the anxiety around AI is exactly that. Like, what is it going to mean for my job? Atlassian cut 1,600 jobs. Amazon's doing a huge AI rollout, laid off 14,000 people. Meta is planning to reduce its workforce by 20%. Then you have the de-skilling as well. Jobs like paralegals, the jobs of coders, graphic designers, creative work. We've got AI bans on Spotify that are entirely AI generated music. There's also managerial control. Actually, in my job, they want to bring in an AI program called Veronica, which has the potential to do moment-by-moment location monitoring of where all the workers are at any given time. Makes it, incredibly hard to take a quick break. You hear about all these horror stories of call centers where people aren't allowed to go to the bathroom. This kind of stuff, it's going to be easier and easier for them to surveil us. Who knows, auto dock our pay, things like that. Where in the best possible world, we'd be able to outsource these mundane jobs so we can focus on creative solutions. And this is going to be a key battleground for unions and workers. This is a report that the union I'm part of, the MUA, did in conjunction with the Centre for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research, and they've put in claims they want to ban companies from collecting and using workers' biometric data. They want unions to have a digital right of entry to examine, audit, and assess the impact of automated systems. There's heaps of stuff here about bargaining rights, transparency, job definition, safety. And there's more that I could name that Victoria Trades Hall has put out, the ACTU. So unions are getting onto this stuff, and strong unions will be able to fight for protections around these issues. But I also think there's hope in that one of the effects of automation is that when you reduce the workforce but you increase the capital, you've got a smaller number of workers who can shut down huge sections of the economy. Even on a small example, you think automated checkouts got rid of so many jobs, right, at Coles and Woolworths. But that one person who has to walk around and help everyone who's having trouble at the machine, if they just walked out, that's 6-10 automated checkouts that wouldn't be working. And of course, there's new jobs created. I talked about the data labelers, IT, people who maintenance jobs, fixing robots, people who work in the data centers, are building the data centers, who are mining the rare earths minerals, that's all jobs. But of course, new jobs can undermine existing unions, so we have to fight to organize these new sections of labor. And I think, if anything, we could argue that capitalism is holding back the full potential of robotics, because the R&D funding, isn't directed towards the elimination of undesirable, poorly paid, dangerous work. Actually, all that money that's going into the data centers, by contrast, some of the other examples I gave, the early cancer detection, those AI models can be trained on, relatively much smaller, highly specialized mobile devices, laptops, basically. They don't need that's the bicycles versus the rockets that I talked about. And this is the kind of thing that, we should be fighting over. What kind of AI do we want? What do we want it to be able to do? Who's going to control it? Do we need these big data centers, or can we get the benefits on smaller, more focused models? We should be fighting for a shorter working week. We should be fighting to stop, a reduction in the workforce. No increased work intensity. Same pay, less hours. No new positions outside of union control. Intellectual property controls for our creative and intellectual work. written management guarantees in our contracts that new technologies will not be used for surveillance and time management. And most of all, like, these productivity shares and these profits need to be taxed, and they need to go back to us in the form of higher wages. Ultimately, we need to fight to take control of the levers of production of these psychopaths who want to use AI to kill more people in Palestine, Iran, Lebanon, make our life in the workplace a living hell. And we can do that, but in the ultimate analysis, that's going to require that we uproot a system of capitalism that puts profit over people, and treats technology as something to be imposed on us rather than something which actually we created, and which is an extension of our own creativity, intelligence, and human potential.